The silence in the Montgomery Industries boardroom was deafening. 20 of America's most powerful business leaders sat frozen as the massive screen displayed video evidence that would destroy lives forever. My God, that's the Henderson account. Board member David Chen stood up, pointing an accusing finger. Richard, you sold our Pentagon contracts to the Russians. Richard Montgomery's face had turned ghostly white, sweat beading on his forehead as his billion-dollar empire crumbled around him. But it was his mistress Vivian who dropped the final bombshell. These people are not as stupid as you said they would be, she snarled, her sweet American accent suddenly replaced by cold Russian pronunciation. My name is Captain Victoria Stepanova of the GRU, and I do not surrender to capitalist pigs. At the head of the table, pregnant Isabella Montgomery watched her cheating husband's world implode. But this was just the beginning of the most shocking revenge story you'll ever hear. If you love stories of betrayal, hidden secrets, and ultimate justice, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. But how did Isabella go from broken, betrayed wife to the powerful woman commanding this boardroom? Let's start from the beginning. The autumn rain drummed against the massive windows of Blackwood Manor, each droplet catching the amber light from the crystal chandeliers that had illuminated this Connecticut estate for over a century. Within the mahogany-paneled walls of what was once America's most prestigious family fortress, a betrayal was about to unfold that would shake the very foundations of the Montgomery dynasty. Isabella Montgomery stood in the grand foyer, her 6-month pregnant silhouette graceful against the marble staircase that spiraled upward like a work of art. At 28, she possessed the kind of elegant beauty that came not from makeup or designer clothes, but from an inner strength that had been cultivated through years of Harvard Law School and a deep love for justice. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple chignon, and her hand rested protectively over her growing belly as she waited for her husband to return from what he claimed was another late board meeting. Richard Montgomery's footsteps echoed through the entrance hall as he pushed through the heavy oak doors, his Armani suit slightly disheveled and his usually perfect hair showing signs of something. At 35, Richard commanded respect in every boardroom in Manhattan. As CEO of Montgomery Industries, a $2 billion empire spanning real estate development and international investments, he was the kind of man who appeared on magazine covers with headlines like The Golden Touch and America's Most Eligible Bachelor, though the latter had changed to Power Couple after his marriage to Isabella 3 years ago. You're home late again, Isabella said softly, her lawyer's instincts picking up on the subtle changes in his demeanor. The board meeting must have run long. Richard's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Something like that. He moved past her toward his study, but Isabella noticed something that made her blood run cold. A delicate gold chain hanging from his jacket pocket, catching the light like a serpent's scale. Richard, wait. Her voice carried the authority she'd once used in courtrooms. What's that in your pocket? He turned, and for the first time in their marriage, Isabella saw something she'd never seen before. Guilt. But it lasted only a moment before his expression hardened into something cold and unfamiliar. We need to talk. Isabella. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Isabella followed him into the study, the same room where his great-grandfather had built the Montgomery Empire, where family portraits of 4 generations watched over mahogany furniture and first-edition law books. But tonight, the room felt different. Tonight, it felt like a courtroom where she was about to be sentenced for crimes she didn't commit. Richard walked to the bar cart and poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon, his father's bourbon, aged 25 years and worth more than most people's cars. He drained it in one gulp before turning to face his wife. I'm not happy, Isabella. The words hit her like a physical blow. What do you mean you're not happy, Richard? We're having a baby. We're what living a lie, he laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think I don't see how you look at me like I'm some kind of charity case you took on, the poor rich boy who needed a smart wife to legitimize him. Isabella's hand instinctively moved to her belly. That's not true, and you know it. I love you. Richard, I've always loved you. Love. He said the word like it tasted bitter. Do you know what love is? Isabella, real love. Not the sanitized, intellectual version you learned about in your law books, but real, passionate, consuming love. The diamond necklace slipped further from his pocket, and Isabella's breath caught. She recognized it now, the same necklace she'd seen in an Instagram post from the exclusive Le Bernardin restaurant just last week. The same necklace that had been wrapped around the throat of Vivian Sterling, the 26-year-old model and influencer who'd been making waves in Manhattan's social scene. You're having an affair. The words came out as a statement, not a question. Isabella's legal training had taught her to recognize evidence when she saw it. Richard's smile was cruel. I'm in love. Isabella. Real love. Something you could never understand. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of heels clicked across the marble foyer. Isabella turned to see Vivian Sterling herself gliding into the study as if she owned the place. And perhaps, Isabella was beginning to realize, she soon would. Vivian was everything Isabella was not. Platinum blonde where Isabella was brunette. Artificially enhanced where Isabella was naturally beautiful. Sharp and predatory where Isabella was warm and nurturing. She wore a tight red dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her blue eyes glittered with the kind of ambition that could cut glass. Darling, Vivian purred, sliding up to Richard and placing a possessive hand on his chest. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Isabella felt the baby kick, as if even her unborn child could sense the evil that had just entered their sanctuary. Actually, Richard said, his arm encircling Vivian's waist. This is perfect timing. Isabella, meet the woman I should have married. Vivian, meet the mistake I'm about to correct. The room seemed to spin around Isabella. Richard, what are you saying? I'm saying that I've made my choice. Richard walked to his desk and pulled out a thick folder of legal documents. These papers transfer ownership of Blackwood Manor to Vivian, effective immediately. It's a gift, a symbol of my commitment to our future together. Isabella's legs nearly gave out. You can't do that. This house, it's been in my family for 4 generations. My grandmother Eleanor left it to me, as your husband, according to Connecticut property law. Richard interrupted. And as the owner, I can do whatever I want with it. Vivian laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. Don't worry, Isabella. I'm not completely heartless. You can stay in the servants' quarters upstairs until you give birth. After that, she shrugged elegantly. Well, I'm sure you'll figure something out. The cruelty of it took Isabella's breath away. The servants' quarters. Richard, this is our home. This is where our child will never live, Richard said flatly. Because I don't want this child. Isabella, I never did. This pregnancy was your idea. Your desperate attempt to trap me in a marriage I never truly wanted. Isabella's hand flew to her throat, where her grandmother Eleanor's locket rested, the one piece of jewelry she never removed. Eleanor Montgomery had been more than a grandmother. She'd been Isabella's mentor, her guide, her inspiration to pursue law and justice. Eleanor had built her own fortune through shrewd investments and an uncanny ability to read people's true intentions. She died 2 years ago, leaving Isabella heartbroken, but also instilled with an unshakable belief that good would always triumph over evil. If only Eleanor could see this betrayal now. I need you to sign these papers, Richard continued, his tone becoming businesslike, as if he were discussing a corporate merger rather than destroying his wife's life. They'll ensure a clean separation. You'll receive a modest settlement, enough to start over somewhere far from here. Isabella looked at the documents with a lawyer's eye, and what she saw made her blood run cold. These aren't just separation papers. Richard, this is a complete transfer of assets. You're taking everything, the house, the trust funds, even the company shares that belong to my grandmother. Business is business. Isabella, you should understand that better than anyone. Vivian moved closer, her perfume cloying and aggressive. You know, Isabella, you should really thank me. I'm freeing you from a loveless marriage. Now you can find someone who actually wants you, though I can't imagine who that would be, especially with a baby weighing you down. The insult hit its mark, but something deeper was bothering Isabella. There was something about Vivian's accent, subtle, but trained ears could detect the slight Eastern European inflection beneath the carefully cultivated American pronunciation. Where are you from originally, Vivian? Isabella asked quietly. Vivian's eyes flashed. What does that matter? Just curious. Your accent is interesting. I'm from Detroit, Vivian said quickly. But Isabella noticed how Richard's hand tightened protectively around her waist. That night, alone in what used to be her bedroom, now relegated to a small guest room on the third floor, Isabella sat by the window and tried to process the complete destruction of her life. The rain had stopped, and moonlight illuminated the extensive gardens that Eleanor had designed herself, with their intricate hedge mazes and rose gardens that bloomed even in late autumn. But as Isabella sat there, something caught her eye in the moonlight, a figure moving through the gardens. Vivian, talking animatedly on her phone. Isabella couldn't hear the words, but she could see the body language secretive, urgent, almost professional. When Isabella finally fell asleep, it was to dreams of her grandmother Eleanor, who seemed to be trying to tell her something important. In the dream, Eleanor kept pointing to the library, saying over and over, "Remember, my dear girl, remember what I taught you about hidden treasures." The next morning brought new humiliations. Isabella woke to find that the locks on her former bedroom had been changed. Her clothes moved to the small servant's room, and her access to the family cars revoked. Vivian had hired security guards, not to protect the house, but to monitor Isabella's every movement. "It's for everyone's safety," Vivian explained with false sweetness as Isabella tried to leave for a doctor's appointment. "Pregnant women can be so unstable." The guard, a thick-set man with dead eyes, stepped into Isabella's path. "Sorry, Mrs. Montgomery. Ms. Sterling's orders. You need permission to leave the property." Isabella felt the walls of her own home closing in around her. This was more than just an affair. This was a systematic campaign to isolate and control her. But why? What did Vivian really want? The answer came sooner than she expected. That evening, while Vivian and Richard celebrated their engagement with champagne in the main dining room, Isabella discovered something that changed everything. Hidden in Richard's jacket pocket, the same jacket he'd worn the night he revealed his betrayal, she found a draft document that made her blood freeze. It was a will, her will, or rather, a forged will in her name, leaving everything to Richard in the event of her accidental death during childbirth complications. The document was dated for next week. Isabella's hands shook as she photographed the papers with her phone. This wasn't just about an affair or even about money. This was about murder. As she crept back to her room, Isabella heard voices from Richard's study. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see Vivian pacing while Richard sat behind his desk. "Too risky," Richard was saying. "If anything happens to her too soon after the birth, there will be questions." "Leave that to me," Vivian replied, and now her accent was clearly audible. "Definitely Eastern European, possibly Russian. I have experience with these situations. A little something in her post-birth medication, and everyone will think it was a tragic complication. It happens more often than people realize." Isabella's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. They were planning to kill her. "What about the baby?" Richard asked. "What about it? You said you never wanted it anyway. An orphaned infant will be easy enough to place for adoption. Clean slate, darling." Isabella backed away from the door, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they would hear it. She had to get help. She had to call the police, call a lawyer, call someone. But as she reached for her phone, she realized the full horror of her situation. Who would believe her Richard was a pillar of the community, a respected businessman with no criminal record? Vivian was a successful model with thousands of social media followers who could vouch for her character. Isabella, on the other hand, was an isolated pregnant woman who had just been publicly abandoned by her husband. The fake will in her phone might be evidence, but a good lawyer could argue it was a draft that was never meant to be used, or even that Isabella herself had forged it to frame her innocent husband. No, she needed more evidence. Much more. And she needed to remember what her grandmother Eleanor had always told her. When the world seems against you, my dear, look to the past for wisdom and to your own strength for the future. As Isabella lay in her narrow bed that night, listening to the sounds of Richard and Vivian celebrating in the rooms below, she made a vow. She would survive this. She would protect her unborn child, and she would make them pay for every moment of pain they had caused. But first, she needed to solve the mystery that her grandmother had left behind. Eleanor Montgomery had been the smartest woman Isabella had ever known, and she'd always suspected that her grandmother had hidden secrets within the walls of Blackwood Manor. Tomorrow, Isabella would begin her search for those secrets, because if Eleanor had taught her anything, it was that the most powerful weapons were often hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. And Isabella was beginning to suspect that moment was fast approaching. As sleep finally claimed her, Isabella's last conscious thought was of her grandmother's favorite saying, "The truth is like a rose. My dear, it may have thorns, but it will always bloom in the end." The morning sun filtered through the small window of Isabella's new quarters, casting long shadows across the cramped room that had once housed the Montgomery family servants. The irony wasn't lost on her. The great-granddaughter of Eleanor Montgomery, reduced to living like hired help in her own ancestral home. Isabella's stomach churned, but not from morning sickness. The baby had been active all night, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them both. She placed both hands on her belly and whispered, "Don't worry, little one. Mama's going to figure this out." A sharp knock on the door interrupted her moment of calm. "Mrs. Montgomery." The voice belonged to one of Vivian's security guards. "Ms. Sterling requests your presence in the kitchen." Isabella dressed carefully in one of the few outfits that still fit her changing body. A simple navy dress that her grandmother had always said brought out her eyes. If she was going to face another humiliation, she would do it with dignity. The kitchen, which had once been Isabella's favorite room in the house, had been transformed. Vivian sat at the island like a queen holding court, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She was video calling someone on her laptop, speaking in rapid Russian. When she saw Isabella, Vivian immediately switched back to English, but not before Isabella caught a few words: schedule, removal, and most chillingly, accident. "Ah, Isabella." Vivian's smile was predatory. "Perfect timing. I was just telling my business associate about our little arrangement here." Isabella noticed the laptop screen had gone dark, but she filed away this piece of information. Vivian was definitely not who she claimed to be. "I wanted to discuss your living situation," Vivian continued, gesturing grandly around the kitchen. "I'm thinking of renovating this entire wing. You know, open concept, marble countertops, that sort of thing. Very modern, very American." The slight emphasis on the last word confirmed Isabella's suspicions about Vivian's true origins. "Of course, the construction noise might be disruptive for someone in your condition," Vivian went on. Vivian went. "Perhaps it would be better if you found alternative accommodations." Isabella straightened her spine. "This is my home, Vivian. My family has lived here for 4 generations." "Was your home," Vivian corrected. "Now it's mine. And I don't particularly enjoy having reminders of Richard's past cluttering up my beautiful new space." One of the guards, the same dead-eyed man from yesterday, stepped closer to Isabella. She could smell tobacco and something else on his breath. Something medicinal and chemical. "Is there a problem here?" Richard's voice cut through the tension as he entered the kitchen, straightening his tie. He was already dressed for work, and Isabella felt a pang of memory for the mornings when they'd shared coffee and planned their day together. No problem at all, darling, Vivian purred, rising to kiss him. I was just explaining to Isabella about the renovations. Richard avoided Isabella's eyes. That sounds reasonable. Isabella, I think it would be best if you made arrangements to leave by the end of the week. The end of the week? Isabella's voice rose. Richard, I'm 6 months pregnant. I can't just... You're a smart woman, Richard said coldly. Figure it out. As he prepared to leave for the office, Isabella made a desperate decision. Richard, I need to see a doctor. The baby hasn't been moving as much, and I'm concerned. For just a moment, she saw something flicker in his eyes, perhaps a memory of the man who had once claimed to love her. Fine, he said finally, but Dmitri will drive you. Isabella's blood ran cold. Dmitri was clearly one of Vivian's guards, and the idea of being trapped in a car with him terrified her. But this might be her only chance to get help. The doctor's appointment was a carefully orchestrated nightmare. Dmitri sat in the waiting room, his eyes never leaving Isabella, while she tried to explain her situation to Dr. Sarah Kim, who had been her physician for 3 years. Dr. Kim, Isabella said quietly, I think my life might be in danger. But Dr. Kim's response chilled her to the bone. Mrs. Montgomery, your husband called ahead and explained about your emotional difficulties. Pregnancy can be very stressful, especially when there are marital problems. I think what you need is rest and perhaps some counseling. Isabella realized with growing horror that Richard and Vivian had gotten there first. They'd poisoned the well, making it seem like she was having a mental breakdown rather than reporting a genuine threat. The baby is fine, Dr. Kim continued, her voice taking on the patronizing tone people used with unstable patients. But I'm going to prescribe some mild sedatives to help you relax. No, Isabella said firmly. I don't want any medication. Mrs. Montgomery, I really think... I said no. Isabella stood up, fighting the urge to scream in frustration. I'm leaving. As she walked past Dmitri in the waiting room, she heard him murmur something into his phone in Russian. Whatever he said, it wasn't good news for her. That evening, Isabella made her most important discovery yet, unable to sleep and desperate for answers. She waited until the house was quiet before creeping down to the library. This had always been her sanctuary, Eleanor's domain, where floor-to-ceiling shelves held not just books, but the accumulated wisdom of generations. Isabella remembered her grandmother's words. If you ever find yourself in real trouble, my dear, remember that libraries hold more than just books. They hold secrets. Using only the moonlight streaming through the tall windows, Isabella began her search. She started with Eleanor's favorite section, the legal texts that had helped her build her fortune in an era when women weren't welcome in boardrooms. Behind a first-edition copy of Blackstone's Commentaries, Isabella's fingers found something unexpected, a small lever hidden in the woodwork. When she pressed it, a section of the bookshelf swung inward with a soft click, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small safe, its digital lock glowing softly in the darkness. Isabella's heart raced as she tried to think of the combination. Eleanor's birthday? No. The founding date of Montgomery Industries? Still no. Then she remembered the locket around her neck, the one Eleanor had given her on her 18th birthday. Engraved inside were the coordinates of Blackwood Manor 41 30 Trudine 73 57 W. She tried the numbers 412033. The safe opened with a soft beep. Inside, Isabella found treasures that would change everything. First, a leather-bound document marked the last will and testament of Eleanor Montgomery, dated just 6 months before Eleanor's death and notarized by Marcus Chen, Eleanor's longtime attorney. Second, a thick folder of financial documents showing wire transfers, offshore accounts, and investment records that painted a picture of massive financial fraud. Third, a USB drive labeled Insurance in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting. And finally, a letter addressed to Isabella in her grandmother's elegant script. My dearest Isabella, if you are reading this, then I was right to fear for your future. Richard Montgomery is not the man we believed him to be, and I have spent the last months of my life gathering evidence of his true nature. You will find everything you need to protect yourself and our family legacy in this safe. Trust Marcus Chen and trust yourself. The truth will set you free, but first it will destroy those who have betrayed you. Be strong, my darling girl. Eleanor. Isabella's hands shook as she read Eleanor's true will. Far from leaving everything to Richard as he claimed, Eleanor had bequeathed 60% of Montgomery Industries directly to Isabella, along with Blackwood Manor and a trust fund worth over $800 million. But there was a condition: Isabella could only claim her inheritance after her 30th birthday, or in the event of dire circumstances requiring immediate protection of the Montgomery legacy. Isabella was only 28, but she was beginning to think her current situation qualified as dire circumstances. The financial documents revealed the true scope of Richard's betrayal. For the past 2 years, he had been systematically embezzling money from Montgomery Industries, funneling it through shell companies to offshore accounts. The total amount was staggering, over $500 million. But the USB drive contained the most explosive evidence of all. Isabella plugged it into her phone and watched in growing horror as video files revealed Richard's secret meetings with representatives of Volkov Industries, a Russian conglomerate with known ties to organized crime. The meeting showed Richard selling proprietary technology and client lists in exchange for massive payments. And in several of the videos, Vivian was present, not as Richard's girlfriend, but as a translator and facilitator. In one particularly damning recording, she could be heard speaking fluent Russian while coordinating the transfer of sensitive military contracts to foreign entities. Isabella realized she was looking at evidence of corporate espionage, money laundering, and possibly treason. But the final video on the drive made her blood run cold. It was dated just 3 weeks ago, a meeting between Richard, Vivian, and a man Isabella didn't recognize. The audio was crystal clear. "The wife is becoming a problem," the stranger said in accented English. "She asked too many questions." "Isabella isn't suspicious," Richard replied. "She's just pregnant and emotional." Vivian laughed coldly. "Emotional women have accidents all the time, especially during childbirth. Very tragic. But these things happen. It needs to look natural," the stranger continued. "No questions, no investigations. Leave that to me," Vivian said. "I've handled similar situations before." Isabella had to cover her mouth to keep from screaming. This wasn't just about money or even love. This was an organized conspiracy to murder her and steal her family's entire legacy. But now she had proof. Now she had weapons. The next morning, Isabella made a crucial phone call. She waited until Vivian and Richard had left the house, then used the landline in Eleanor's old office to call Marcus Chen. Marcus had been Eleanor's attorney for over 30 years, and Isabella had known him since childhood. He was one of the few people she could trust completely. "Isabella," Marcus's voice was filled with concern. "I've been worried about you. I heard about the separation. Marcus, I need to see you immediately. I found Eleanor safe." There was a long pause. "Are you alone?" "Yes, but not for long. They're watching me constantly." "Can you get to my office?" Isabella thought quickly. "I can try. But Marcus, there's something else. I think Richard and his girlfriend are planning to kill me." Another pause. Longer this time. "Isabella, that's a very serious accusation. I have proof, video evidence, financial records. Marcus, Eleanor suspected something was wrong, didn't she?" "Yes," Marcus said quietly. "She came to me 6 months before she died. She discovered some irregularities in the company books and was concerned about Richard's associates. She asked me to prepare certain safeguards." "Then you know about the real will?" "I do, and I've been waiting for the right time to act on it. Can you get to the parking garage of the Metropolitan Building at noon? I'll have a car waiting." Isabella's heart pounded. "What about the guards?" "Leave that to me. I've been preparing for this day for 2 years. At precisely noon." Isabella stood in the servants' entrance of Blackwood Manor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd told Dimitri she was going to take a nap, and she prayed he wouldn't check on her for at least an hour. A delivery truck pulled up to the back entrance, the kind that brought groceries and supplies to the manor every week. But instead of the usual driver, Marcus Chen emerged from the passenger seat. "Quick," he said, helping Isabella into the back of the truck among boxes of vegetables and canned goods. "We don't have much time." As the truck pulled away from Blackwood Manor, Isabella felt like she was escaping a prison. But she also knew this was just the beginning of the most dangerous phase of her life. Marcus's law office occupied the top 3 floors of a Manhattan skyscraper, and his conference room offered a stunning view of Central Park. But Isabella had no attention to spare for scenery as Marcus spread the contents of Eleanor's safe across the mahogany table. "Your grandmother was remarkable," Marcus said, studying the financial documents. "She uncovered Richard's embezzlement schemes months before her death and began collecting evidence. But she died before she could act on it. Did she know about Vivian? She suspected Richard had criminal associates, but she didn't know the full extent of the conspiracy." Marcus picked up the USB drive. "This is extraordinary evidence. Isabella, with this, we can not only stop Richard but potentially break up an entire international money laundering operation." Isabella placed her hands on her belly. "But what about the immediate threat they're planning to kill me after the baby is born?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "There's someone I need you to meet." He pressed a button on his phone, and moments later, a woman in her 40s entered the conference room. She was tall, athletic, with intelligent dark eyes and an air of quiet authority. "Isabella, this is Agent Sarah Rodriguez from the FBI. Sarah, this is Eleanor's granddaughter." Agent Rodriguez shook Isabella's hand firmly. "Mrs. Montgomery, we've been investigating your husband's activities for the past 18 months. The evidence you've brought us today could be the key to bringing down a major international criminal network. You've been investigating Richard, Vivian, whose real name is Victoria Stepanova, and their associates. We believe they're part of a sophisticated operation that infiltrates wealthy American families to steal both money and sensitive information." Isabella felt dizzy. "How many other families?" "At least 6 that we know of. In each case, a beautiful woman seduces a wealthy man, isolates him from his family, and systematically drains his assets. Usually, the man's wife dies under mysterious circumstances." The room spun around Isabella. "I'm not the first." "No, but you might be the last. If we can use your evidence to build a solid case, we can stop this entire operation." Marcus leaned forward. "Isabella, Agent Rodriguez is proposing that you work with the FBI to gather additional evidence. It would be dangerous, but—" "I'll do it," Isabella said immediately. "Whatever it takes." Agent Rodriguez smiled grimly. "I was hoping you'd say that, because we have a plan that should put Richard and Victoria behind bars permanently, but it's going to require you to be very brave." As they outlined the plan, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks' hope, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the most dangerous part of her ordeal was yet to come, because in 3 days, Montgomery Industries was scheduled to hold its annual board meeting, and that meeting would be the perfect opportunity to spring the trap that would destroy Richard and Vivian forever. The question was, would Isabella survive long enough to see justice served? The morning of November 15th dawned cold and clear over Manhattan, with the kind of crystalline light that made the city's skyscrapers gleam like monuments to ambition and power. 47 floors above the street, in the executive boardroom of Montgomery Tower, 20 of the most influential business leaders in America were gathering for what they believed would be a routine annual meeting. They had no idea they were about to witness the downfall of a criminal empire. Isabella stood before the mirror in the ladies' restroom on the 46th floor, adjusting her navy blue maternity dress, the same one she'd worn to her law school graduation, when Eleanor had sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Today, Eleanor would have her justice. Isabella's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Rodriguez. "All teams in position. You're not alone in there." Through the earpiece hidden beneath her hair, Marcus Chen's voice was calm and reassuring. Remember, Isabella, you have every legal right to be there. That boardroom belongs to you now. Isabella took a deep breath and walked toward the double doors of the Montgomery Industries boardroom. Through the glass, she could see Richard at the head of the massive table, looking confident and in control as he gestured at the presentation screen. He wore his lucky navy suit, the one he'd worn when he'd first asked her to marry him. Vivian sat beside him like a queen consort, her platinum hair swept into an elegant chignon, wearing a white dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. She looked every inch the successful businesswoman, except for the calculating coldness in her eyes that Isabella now recognized as the mark of a predator. The board members were exactly what Isabella expected: older white men in expensive suits, plus two women who'd fought their way into boardrooms through sheer brilliance and determination. These were people who controlled billions of dollars and influenced policy at the highest levels of government. Richard was in the middle of his presentation when the doors opened, which is why I'm proposing a complete restructuring of our international partnerships to maximize. He stopped mid-sentence as Isabella walked into the room, followed by Marcus Chen, Agent Rodriguez, and a court stenographer. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. Isabella. Richard's voice cracked slightly. What are you doing here? Isabella moved to the empty chair at the far end of the table, the chair that had always been reserved for the Montgomery family patriarch. Today, she was claiming it as the rightful heir to Eleanor's legacy. I'm here for the board meeting. Richard, I am, after all, a Montgomery. Vivian's eyes flashed dangerously. I think you're confused, dear. This is a closed meeting for board members and major shareholders only. Isabella smiled calmly. Then I'm exactly where I belong. She nodded to Marcus, who stood and addressed the room with the authority of a man who'd been practicing corporate law for 4 decades. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Marcus Chen, representing the estate of Eleanor Montgomery. I have some documents that I believe will be of significant interest to this board. Richard's face had gone pale. Marcus, this is highly irregular. Isabella isn't even a shareholder, Marcus interrupted. Actually, Richard, that's where you're wrong. The court stenographer stepped forward and handed Marcus a sealed envelope. Marcus opened it with deliberate ceremony, removing a document that had been notarized, witnessed, and filed with the appropriate courts. This is the last will and testament of Eleanor Montgomery, dated 6 months before her death. In it, Mrs. Montgomery bequeathed 60% of Montgomery Industries, along with all associated properties and assets, to her granddaughter, Isabella Montgomery. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Board member James Wellington, who'd known Eleanor for 30 years, stood up abruptly. That's impossible, he said. Eleanor left everything to Richard. I was at the reading of her will. You were at the reading of a fraudulent will, Marcus replied calmly. The document you heard was a forgery, created to conceal Eleanor's true intentions. Richard found his voice. This is ridiculous. That document is obviously fake. Isabella is having some kind of breakdown. Richard, Isabella's voice cut through his protest like a blade. Would you like to explain to the board why you've embezzled over $500 million from this company? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Richard's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, while Vivian's hand moved instinctively toward her purse. That's a serious accusation. Isabella, said board member Patricia Mills, the first woman to ever serve as CFO of a Fortune 500 company. Do you have evidence? I do. Isabella nodded to Agent Rodriguez, who moved to the presentation screen and plugged in a laptop. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see is footage obtained through a federal investigation into international money laundering and corporate espionage. The first video showed Richard in a dimly lit restaurant, sliding an envelope across the table to a man with Slavic features. The audio was crystal clear. The defense contracts should be worth at least $50 million to your people, Richard was saying. But I want my usual 20%. Of course, the man replied in accented English. Volkov Industries always honors its agreements. A gasp went around the room. Volkov Industries was a known front for Russian intelligence operations. The second video was even more damning. It showed Vivian, speaking fluent Russian, coordinating the transfer of sensitive client information to foreign operatives. But it was the third video that caused board member David Chen, no relation to Marcus, to actually stand up and point an accusing finger at Richard. My God, that's the Henderson account, Richard. You sold our Pentagon contracts to the Russians. Richard was sweating now, his confident demeanor cracking like ice in spring. This is obviously doctored footage. Isabella is clearly having some kind of mental breakdown and, "Shut up, Richard." The voice belonged to Vivian, but it was no longer the sweet, artificial tone she'd been using. This voice was cold, professional, and carried a distinct Eastern European accent. "These people are not as stupid as you said they would be." Agent Rodriguez smiled grimly. "Victoria Stepanova, also known as Vivian Sterling, you are under arrest for corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit murder, and violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act." Murder. The word escaped from several board members at once. Isabella stood up slowly, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. "Richard and Victoria have been planning to kill me after my baby is born. They forged a will leaving everything to Richard, then planned to make my death look like complications from childbirth." The room erupted in shocked voices, but Isabella wasn't finished. "But there's more. Richard, would you like to explain to the board why you've been transferring money to overseas accounts? Or why you've been selling our client lists to foreign governments? Or why your girlfriend is actually a Russian intelligence operative?" Richard's composure finally shattered completely. "You don't understand. They threatened me," Victoria said. "If I didn't cooperate, they would kill both of us." "Oh, Richard," Victoria said with contempt, no longer bothering to hide her accent. "You were never in any danger. You were always going to die after Isabella. We just needed you alive long enough to access all the accounts." The confession hung in the air like a bomb blast. Agent Rodriguez was already moving toward Victoria, handcuffs ready, but the Russian operative wasn't finished. "You Americans are so naive," she snarled, pulling a small device from her purse. "You think this is over? This is just one operation? There are dozens like me, in boardrooms and bedrooms across your country, bleeding you dry from the inside." "Put the device down, Victoria," Agent Rodriguez commanded, her weapon drawn. "My name is Captain Victoria Stepanova of the GRU," she replied proudly. "And I do not surrender to capitalist pigs." She pressed the button on the device, and Isabella's blood ran cold as she realized it was some kind of detonator. But instead of an explosion, the lights went out, and emergency alarms began blaring throughout the building. In the chaos that followed, Victoria made a desperate attempt to escape, but Agent Rodriguez and her team were ready. The Russian operative was tackled to the ground before she could reach the emergency stairs, her device clattering across the marble floor. As emergency lighting flickered on, Richard made his own pathetic attempt at escape, but board member James Wellington, 70 years old but still surprisingly spry, tripped him with his walking cane. "You betrayed Eleanor's trust," Wellington said as Richard sprawled on the floor. "You betrayed your wife, and you betrayed your country. I've seen a lot of despicable things in my 70 years, Richard, but you might just be the worst of them all." Within minutes, the room was filled with FBI agents, and both Richard and Victoria were in custody. The board members sat in stunned silence as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Patricia Mills was the first to speak. "Isabella, on behalf of this board, I want to apologize. We should have seen the signs. We should have protected Eleanor's legacy better." Isabella looked around the room at the faces of these powerful people, some shocked, some ashamed, all of them now fully understanding how completely they'd been deceived. "There's no need to apologize," she said quietly. "My grandmother always said that the most dangerous predators are the ones who look the most harmless." Richard and Victoria were very good at what they did. Marcus stepped forward with another folder. "There is, however, the matter of Isabella's inheritance to formalize. As of this moment, she is the majority shareholder of Montgomery Industries and the rightful owner of all Eleanor Montgomery's assets. The vote was unanimous. As the board members filed out, still shaking their heads in disbelief, Isabella remained seated at the head of the table, her hands resting on her belly where her baby was kicking vigorously. Agent Rodriguez approached her with a gentle smile. "How are you feeling?" Isabella thought for a moment. "Like I can finally breathe again, like the nightmare is over." "It is over," Marcus assured her. "Richard will spend the next 20 years in federal prison, and Victoria will likely never see freedom again. You're safe, Isabella. You and the baby are safe." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Isabella could see all of Manhattan spread out below her, a city full of ambition and dreams, where her great-great-grandfather had first built the Montgomery fortune through honest work and determination. Tonight, she would sleep in her own bed in Blackwood Manor, secure in the knowledge that justice had been served and her family's legacy was protected. But first, there was one more thing she needed to do. 6 months later, Isabella Montgomery stood in the nursery of Blackwood Manor, watching sunlight stream through windows that had been restored to their original glory. The room, which had once been planned as Richard's study, was now painted a soft yellow and filled with antique furniture that had been passed down through 4 generations of Montgomery children. In her arms, baby Alexander Eleanor Montgomery, named for his great-great-grandmother, slept peacefully, his tiny fingers wrapped around the chain of Eleanor's locket. At 3 months old, he already showed signs of the Montgomery determination, refusing to sleep unless he was held by his mother and demonstrating an impressive vocal range when displeased. Isabella had gained more than just her inheritance in the past year. She had gained herself. The transformation of both Isabella and Montgomery Industries had been remarkable. Under her leadership, the company had not only recovered the embezzled funds, but had grown by 40%, shifting focus from defense contracts to sustainable technology and renewable energy. The Pentagon contracts that Richard had sold to Russian operatives were canceled, but the innovative solar panel technology that Isabella's team developed more than made up for the lost revenue. Forbes had named her their CEO of the Year, and Harvard Business School had invited her to deliver the commencement address on leadership through adversity. But the recognition that meant the most to Isabella was the letter she'd received from the wives of the other men who had been targeted by Victoria's criminal network. Thanks to the evidence Isabella had provided, 5 other international espionage cells had been identified and dismantled. 12 women who had been targeted for elimination were now safe, and their families' fortunes had been recovered and returned. Isabella had used part of her inheritance to establish the Eleanor Foundation, which provided legal assistance and safe housing for women escaping abusive relationships. In its first year, the foundation had helped over 800 women rebuild their lives. But perhaps the most satisfying change was what had happened to Blackwood Manor itself. The east wing of the mansion had been converted into a training center for female entrepreneurs, where women could attend intensive business courses and receive mentorship from successful female executives. The program had a waiting list of over 2,000 applicants. Isabella had kept Eleanor's library exactly as it had been, except for the addition of a bronze plaque that read, "Eleanor Montgomery, a woman who knew that the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight." The secret safe remained, but now it held Isabella's own important documents, her will properly executed and filed, trust documents for Alexander's future, and her grandmother's original letter, which she read whenever she needed inspiration. A soft knock on the nursery door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called softly. Dr. Michael Torres entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the gentle smile that had first attracted Isabella when he'd been assigned as Alexander's pediatrician. At 32, Michael was everything Richard had pretended to be: kind, honest, devoted to his work, and completely unimpressed by wealth or status. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on friendship and mutual respect rather than passion and deception. Michael had been there during Isabella's difficult recovery from the trauma of Richard's betrayal, never pushing, always supporting, treating both Isabella and Alexander with a kind of love that didn't demand anything in return. "How's our boy?" Michael asked, gently stroking Alexander's soft dark hair. "Perfect," Isabella replied, meaning it completely. "I think he's going to be a CEO someday. He's already very good at getting what he wants." Michael laughed softly. "With you as his mother, I don't doubt it. Speaking of which, the papers came through today?" Isabella's heart skipped. Michael was referring to the adoption papers that would make him Alexander's legal father. Not because the baby needed a father, but because they were planning to be married next month and wanted to make their family official in every way. The wedding would be small and intimate, held in Eleanor's rose garden on a warm Saturday in May. Isabella would wear her grandmother's wedding dress, which had been carefully preserved for over 50 years, and Alexander would serve as ring bearer with significant assistance from his honorary aunt, Agent Rodriguez, who had become a close family friend. "There's something else," Michael said, his expression growing more serious. "I got a call from the federal prosecutor today. Richard's sentencing hearing is next week." Isabella nodded. She had been dreading this moment, but she knew it was necessary for her complete healing. "I want to be there." "Are you sure you don't owe him anything?" "Isabella, I know, but I think Eleanor would want me to see justice served completely." The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was packed with reporters and curiosity seekers on the day of Richard Montgomery's sentencing. Isabella sat in the front row, wearing a simple black dress and holding Alexander, who seemed fascinated by all the activity around him. Richard looked like a broken man as he stood before the judge in his orange prison jumpsuit. The confident businessman who had once commanded respect in every boardroom in America was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to have aged 20 years in the past 12 months. "Mr. Montgomery," Judge Patricia Harrison said sternly, "you have pleaded guilty to charges of embezzlement, conspiracy, treason, and conspiracy to commit murder. Before I pass sentence, do you have anything to say?" Richard turned to look at Isabella, and for a moment she saw a flash of the man she had once loved. "Your Honor, I know that nothing I say can undo the damage I've caused. I betrayed my wife, my country, and everything my family stood for. I was seduced by money and power, and I lost sight of what really mattered." He paused, and his voice breaking slightly. "Isabella, I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that every day in prison, I think about what we could have had together. I threw away the best thing in my life for nothing. I'm sorry." Isabella felt tears on her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of closure, of finally being able to let go of the last pieces of pain that Richard had caused. Judge Harrison was not moved by Richard's statement. "Mr. Montgomery, your crimes were not committed in a moment of weakness. They were part of a calculated plan to betray your country and murder your wife. You will serve 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole." As Richard was led away in shackles, Isabella felt the last weight lift from her shoulders. It was over. Truly over. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, but Isabella had no statement to make. Agent Rodriguez helped her through the crowd to a waiting car, where Michael was waiting with a baby carrier and a proud smile. "How do you feel?" he asked as they drove away from the courthouse. Isabella looked down at Alexander, who was reaching for her locket with determined little fingers. "Free," she said simply. "Finally free." That evening, back at Blackwood Manor, Isabella stood in Eleanor's library reading her grandmother's letter one more time. "The truth will set you free, but first it will destroy those who have betrayed you." Eleanor had been right about everything. The truth had destroyed Richard and Victoria, but it had also set Isabella free to become the woman she was meant to be. As she prepared to put the letter back in the safe, Isabella noticed something she had missed before, a small postscript at the bottom of the page, P.S. Check behind the portrait of your great-grandfather in the main hall. There are more family secrets that you should know when you're ready. Isabella smiled, even from beyond the grave. Eleanor was still full of surprises, but those secrets could wait. Tonight, Isabella wanted to focus on the present, her healthy son sleeping upstairs, her fiancé preparing dinner in the kitchen, and the company that bore her family name thriving under her leadership. Tomorrow, she would continue building the legacy that Eleanor had entrusted to her. She would raise Alexander to value justice and compassion above wealth and power. She would help other women find their strength in the face of betrayal and abuse. And she would ensure that the Montgomery name represented everything good about American business and innovation. But tonight, as the sun set over the gardens that Eleanor had designed with such love and care, Isabella Montgomery was simply a woman who had fought for her life and won. The nightmare was over. The dream was just beginning. As she walked upstairs to tuck Alexander into his crib, Isabella paused at the portrait of her great-grandfather that hung in the main hall. Tomorrow, she would investigate Eleanor's final secret, but she suspected she already knew what she would find. Another layer of protection, another safeguard, another example of Eleanor's infinite wisdom and love. The Montgomery women had always been fighters, and thanks to Eleanor's careful planning and Isabella's courage, they always would be. In his nursery, Alexander stirred in his sleep and smiled, as if he too understood that he was part of something larger than himself, a legacy of strength, justice, and love that would continue for generations to come. And somewhere in the mansion that had sheltered 4 generations of her family, Isabella could almost hear Eleanor's voice whispering on the wind. "Well done, my darling girl. Well done."